This begins an interview with George Massey and continues an earlier one that was recorded several years ago on August 1st, 2003. But today's interview is being conducted on April 11th, 2007, actually in the Center for the Study of War and Society at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, Tennessee, with Kurt Peeler and
Justin Mintz.
And thank you again for making time on sort of visit home, or at least visit to Knoxville.
Glad to do it.
And let me start off with Justin, who is in the ROTC program, and he wanted to ask some questions about sort of your earlier sort of ROTC experiences and earlier career. So I'll let him start.
You talk a lot about being a platoon leader. How did you like being a platoon leader?
Well, it was interesting in that's where you learn everything about leadership. Even though we'd had our leadership courses here at the university, but when you finally get your own unit and you have to deal with the day-to-day things that troops can get involved in and you can get involved in, that's where you learn what it's all about. To give you a little bit of a background, my first platoon sergeant was a Korea War veteran, Sergeant Carl Poole. And I remember the first time we met, he said, "Well, Lieutenant, let's go to the mess hall and get a cup of coffee." And I said, "Well, I don't drink coffee." And he looked at me and said, "Sir, you'll never make in this man's army." So 21 years later, I retired after a career in the military, so I guess I did okay. But he was a real good, solid NCO and taught me a lot. And I had the good sense, I guess, to listen to my platoon, to sergeant and my NCOs that I had. I was very fortunate. The unit I came into was being built up and being fully staffed to go to what they call Rota Plan, which was a rotation deal that we had going on back in the early 60s between battle groups going into Germany and swapping with a battle group that was coming back to Fort Benning, Georgia. So our units were being fully staffed. So consequently, my first platoon was a full platoon, rifle platoon down in the infantry company. A lot of times you don't get that or didn't get that in some units, but we were fortunate enough to have that. So as a platoon leader, I had all the problems you have and all the successes you have as a platoon leader when you've got good soldiers. Now, we went from the 2nd Infantry Division, which was, quote, straight leg. In other words, we were ground pounders, to a battle group situation in Germany, and we were mechanized infantry. We had the armored personnel carriers. So that added another little wrinkle in because you had the maintenance and the upkeep of these big 4 pieces of iron that you had to take care of. So again, as a platoon leader, you had your responsibilities increased a little bit. So yeah, it was just a continuation of what I had started in ROTC here at the University of Tennessee. And I'll have to say, we had a real good staff here at the University of Tennessee. And, we had a big program back then. It was it was mandatory. So we had a brigade of about, I want to say 2,500 cadets. And I was fortunate enough, I guess, if you want to call it that, to have been selected as brigade commander my senior year. So I had a lot of folks down under me. And again, it was a matter of, we had good people in the staff and had good people down the chain. And of course we had good cadre, Captain Wright, who was one of our chief advisors, and Captain Daniel. And I don't know if you've met him or not, Jack Daniel. I think I'm sure he's probably been over at the ROTC department. He's still around here, I think. He was, at that point, he had been in Vietnam already by the time he got back here to the department. So, or had not been in Vietnam per se, but had been in some good situations. So it was, just a continuation of that training I had here at UT.
Yeah, I noticed your picture on the wall over there is for brigade commander. What was the branch selection process like back then?
Back then, it was pretty, we all got active duty. That was, at that time, the military was, a heck of a lot bigger than it is today. So if you wanted active duty and wanted to go to a particular branch, that was pretty, pretty assured that you could do that. And I never had really thought about anything other than infantry. I said that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to be airborne ranger and all that stuff. So It was just a matter of putting in your paperwork. Now you had to put down, I think, 3 choices, but there again, needs of the service, always is paramount. But basically, if you wanted to go in armor, if you wanted to go in engineer, they were pretty accommodating. I don't know of any. I don't remember, of course, all the specifics, but I don't know of anyone that didn't get, quote, what they wanted as their first choice. So the selection process was, and again, the fact that, based on the fact I was a DMS, single military student or graduate, and then, I guess the folks over there, the cadre probably put forward, hey, this guy ought to get his first choice. So that's kind of how that went.
So you get to your first unit. What was your relationship with your commander like there?
First commander I had was a first lieutenant, and a very interesting individual, to say the least. Actually, the biggest relationship, or the closest relationship I had at that point, was with our executive officer, Lieutenant Randall, who was first lieutenant. And it's kind of interesting. This is 1962, and it was the first black officer that I'd ever, quote, been served with, or, quote, exposed to, if that's a correct term. But had no problems with either one of them. As a matter of fact, this Lieutenant Salvaggio was our company commander. He left pretty soon thereafter because his tour as company commander ended. But and so when we went to Germany on the rota plan situation, we had a captain, because they had built the unit up, as I was indicated earlier. And they brought in a lot of captains to take over these companies going over on this rota plan, or this rotation thing we were doing. So Captain Kennedy, and he had just come out of the career course, the infantry career course, and he was squared away. And he taught me a lot, and he would jack you up when you need to be jacked up, but he would also pat you on the back when things went pretty good. So it was a good relationship. And Lieutenant Randall, the executive officer I had, he was real good, real straight individual. And so much so that the first day I was reported into the unit, just to give you a little story how they operated, he looked at me and he says, "Lieutenant, you will conduct PT in the morning." It was not, can you, or do you want to? It was, you will conduct physical training in the morning. So again, harkening back to my training here at the university, that was one of the things we did a lot of and knew how to do. The Army Daily Dozen. I don't know if they still have the Army Daily Dozen anymore, but so I filled the company in the next morning. They didn't know who the world I was, because a lot of folks had never seen me. Because I got in there that afternoon, the next morning, here I'm out in front of the company, and we fell in, did the Army Daily Dozen. I took them on a run because I was in good shape. And that was another thing that I hit the ground running, literally, and immediately. And I think this is one of the things, being prepared and having the background I got here at the university, that first experience, from that day forward, the people knew who I was in the company. Man, this lieutenant's something else, because I took them on a pretty good run, and I did make one mistake. We went by the headquarters, and I counting cadence, and I said on the left sick call, and that was the headquarters up there, and they didn't particularly care for that. There's a company coming back on sick calls. So it was all fun again, and the troops enjoyed it. They thought, well, this is all right. This lieutenant got a little spunk about him. So that was my initial introduction, and but the relationship I had with the commanding officers was always good. I mean, I tried to do what they wanted done, and when I didn't do, then I was told about it.
So after a year or two with this unit, or how many years were you with this unit?
Stayed there 2 years, and this was in the early 60s, and we went to Germany, came back. And in the meantime, I'd gotten to jump school, airborne school, and I got sent off to Ranger school. Didn't get to Ranger school until I got back from this rota plan as a lieutenant. And at that time, our assistant division commander was General Corley. And General Corley was kind of an interesting individual. He was a big proponent for the Ranger school. And one of the things he would do, he would look at all the infantry lieutenants, and if you didn't have a ranger tab, you got sent to ranger school. There was no questions asked. And of course, when I got back from rotoplan, I was on orders right away, which I wanted to do. That was not a matter of me not wanting to go to ranger school. But I will tell you one little story about General Corley. I digress every now and then. Dr. Peeler
Well, you have a
knows.
great digression, so
Well,
don't need to apologize.
But General Corley was, he looked like an eagle. I mean, he had just a stare that could just, melt you if you needed to be. But he made a comment one night at a dining in, which is the dress blues and tennis shoes that you do every now and then. And he got up and he said, General MacArthur has 7 silver stars. I have 8. And I mean, that was just kind of the way he phrased it, so much to say that, hey, I'm a war horse too. And he was quite decorated, but he was also very good. And one of the techniques he used is that he would come out and inspect training. As the assistant division commander, that was one of the things he did. He went out, he was ADC for training, as we call him. We had ADC for supplies or whatever, the other admin. But he would come out and inspect you. And of course, you kind of knew he was coming and everybody had everything all together. Well, one of the things he would do is the next day come right back. And you may not be prepared as well that day. And that's what he tried to do. He wanted to see how things were really, on a day-to-day basis being run. But he was usually pretty good. He didn't, if things were really screwed up, he would chomp you hard. But otherwise, he was pretty good about it. But in any event, so after about 2 years, I was sitting there one day and I get a phone call from the S1 or the G1 actually in the division. And, I'll digress a little bit. My older brother by this time had come back and he was in the G3 shop at division. So you had 2 brothers in the same unit at one time, although he was older and senior in rank to me, of course. But the G1 had called and says, we've got inquiries. They have done a screening of all infantry lieutenants, first lieutenants who are airborne ranger qualified, and they're looking for lieutenants who would like to go to special forces. Would you be interested? So I thought about it and I said, well, yeah, that sounds like it might be a lot of fun. I didn't know that much about special forces at that point because we're talking 64 and things were just starting to build up in special forces. So in any event, the next day I called him back and I said, yeah. He said, okay, I've got you, we'll set you up to go to the 8th special, I guess it was the 8th at that point, down in Panama. And so we'll send you the language school. Said you need to take the language aptitude test. I think it was called a ALAT or something. I forget exactly what it was called. It was a little test you took to see if you had aptitude for language. So I went back, and then that night I said, well, the 10th is over in Germany. That might be a nice place to go because I'd already been over in Germany for 6 months. I thought, well, so I called him back and I said, hey, do you think they would have a slot for the 10th Special Forces in Germany? He said, ain't no problem. They're just filling slots. The G1, the personnel guy, said, okay. And he said, you will send you to language school once you take the ALAT. I think it's, again, what it's called. And you'll take the Czech language. So I took the test and I got orders and shipped out from Monterey, California, the Defense Language Institute out of Monterey, California. Little did I know that my aptitude for language in the Czech language was a little weak, and being very honest, and it was a tough 47 weeks in the language school. That's how long it was. 6 hours a day, 47 weeks, and eventually I did learn the language and passed the course, and then went off to the 10th Special Forces in Germany. Get into Germany, and of course I went, in the meantime, after the language school, had to go to the unconventional, at that time it was called the Unconventional Warfare School at Fort Bragg, and I forget what they call it now.
I think it's Special Forces Qualification Course now, because I eventually came back and ran that for the officers there at Bragg. Kind of an interesting tie-in. But anyhow, went through that course, got into Germany in November, and immediately went off to ski training and stuff like that. And of course, it was the dead of the winter. By the next spring of 65, I guess, or maybe, no, I guess it would be 66. The 5th Special Forces was already in Vietnam and had deployed almost en masse. So they had all these requirements to fill slots in the 5th Special Forces. Well, the 10th was sitting there fat and happy because we had a lot. I mean, we were fully staffed at this point. All the A teams had XO or COs and XOs, or captains and second lieutenants, or most cases first lieutenants. So anyway, they just basically moved all of us to Vietnam to replace the guys who went over there in the 5th. So in 66, the summer of 66, went to Vietnam with the 5th Special Forces. And of course, did a year tour there and then came back to, came back to Fort Benning and was what they call a snowbird for a while and kind of waited for the advanced course to start. And then,
how long were you waiting? When you said you had to wait, how long did you have to wait before the course started?
It was, I want to say, golly,
was it weeks or months?
Yeah, it was 3 or 4 months.
Okay, so it was a real.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, we kind of counted, did inventories, and just as they call us, snowbirds. We kind of, or blackbirds, I think is what they call. I mean, you just kind of waited for the course to start.
So you literally waited. I mean, they essentially made busy work for you.
Yeah, and they, you would get in on some inspections and things like that, just kind of keep you employed. You couldn't just go off and play golf.
Yeah, but I'm also struck because you've been in combat and fairly rigorous combat. I mean, you didn't have a desk job in Vietnam. You would have been in the. Yeah. What was it like to go from that, and now you're not even in a course. You're essentially doing busy work.
It was a pretty good break, to be very honest.
So you actually, you didn't mind the sort of.
No, the busy work didn't bother me. I mean, it was just one of those things that, and I was not by my, I wasn't unique, to put it that way, because of just the way the course time started or broke. So. There were a few of us like that because they had to get us, slotted somewhere, and then the advanced course was coming along. So we, once it started, then we were there for a year. And at that point, the commanding general at Fort Benning, who was commandant of the infantry school and also commanded Fort Benning, a General Wright, who had been in the Second World War and had been captured and had survived the Bataan Death March. And I think I know there's a book written, I think the title of it is How Hell Forged a General. And he was a young lieutenant in the Second World War at that time over in the Pacific, of course, on the Manila and Bataan, and survived the Death March. And then he eventually, he alluded to that in our opening comments to us. And he said, gentlemen, he said, every day I'm so thankful to be here. And so he said, it's hard to convey that to you if you haven't been where I've been. I mean, he was a very humble individual, but a very astute. You could tell he was a real fine gentleman, and that's the way he treated the courses. He was not a screamer and a shouter and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things he did tell us, and it was kind of interesting, he put out the percentages. He said 99.6% of you have been to Vietnam already. We were all combat veterans going to the advanced course. And we looked around and said, where's that 0.4% that hadn't been yet? We want to see them. I mean, it was kind of a joke. But he said, 99.6% of you have been to Vietnam, and the chances are that you'll all go back to Vietnam after the advanced course is over. So he said, you're here for 9 months. Enjoy your time with your families. He said, now, sure, you're here to study and learn and become a better officer. But he said, enjoy the time with your families. And, they really pounded that all year long. Even the people down under him said the same thing. So
they really meant it. It wasn't just lip service.
Yeah, it wasn't lip service. No, they said, you guys are going back, so you might as well enjoy it.
So it sounds like they really made the training that, in fact, you had time with your families.
They did. There were some, field problems, but not that much. Yeah. And the classroom, it was basically a classroom type setup, and we were, released a lot of afternoons and things like that. Weekends, we were pretty free. So
I'm sort of curious because almost everyone I interview, whether they're a career or whether they're drafty or whether they're volunteered, serve for their duration and get out. Training is very vivid, at least basic training and often initial officer training. But I wonder, what is it like having been in combat? I mean, you've been well trained. You give the impression before going to Vietnam. Yeah. What's it like to come back after seeing a lot of combat and go back to a classroom and to
Well,
receive additional training? I mean, what's
again, to give you one of the little digressions that I go into, like I say, 99% of us, we didn't know if those figures were correct. Well, we assumed they were because everybody you looked around, they had a combat patch on their right shoulder for the most part. Well, you've got a bunch of young captains who were full of pea and vinegar anyway, all infantry types, most of us airborne, ranger, and all this, old infantry ground pounders. Well, instructors had a difficult job trying to make it interesting and trying to bring you back into, quote, the real world, if you will, the basic infantry tactics of how you're supposed to deploy your units and do all this stuff. Of course, they were making us support, junior staff and battalion and brigade level staffs. That's what this was all about. But in any event, we had some pretty, how would I say this, characters in our class. And almost immediately, one of the first things that came out was, an instructor would be up and he would be making a point about, and to the effect that, if you don't apply these principles or if you don't learn this lesson, it may come back to haunt you in combat. Well, okay, you're talking to some combat veterans. Well, our class came up with a little cry of 48, 49, 50, some shit. It's kind of being, a little flippant toward this instructors. Well, the instructors went along with it. They had a difficult job and they said, okay, that's not. So anyway, that was kind of our attitude initially was, oh, okay, going to teach us something.
Your instructors, what were their background? I mean, you were all combat veterans.
Well, most of them were the same.
Yeah.
They had already been, and some were even older, had already been and were majors and for the most part had been around a little way. So they understood where we were coming from because a lot of them had already, had been in combat, came back, took the advanced course, and then stayed there as instructors. And so there again, of course, we had other combat arms and other branches in there that had their particular expertise that they were getting across to us, supply, transportation, all this. And a lot of these guys had already been to Vietnam. So again, they knew what, kind of our approach was going to be, I guess. And they tried to make it, as palatable as they could to get our attention and keep it.
One question I have, I guess, I have several questions coming out of it. How useful was it particularly when you went back into combat in Vietnam?
Having gone to the advanced course again, there again, you don't ever stop learning.
Yeah.
And that's the key. And you try to take those things that they do try to teach you. And of course, as you well know, I say as you well know, as you can probably glean, a lot of times, the things you get in the books are not what
that's what often isn't written down. I mean, because I've gotten that sense in every profession, particularly in the military.
You can have the basic principles and the basic background, but on a day-to-day basis, you're going to get things that, my God, they didn't teach us about this, or we didn't have this, brought out to us because as I've said before, and it's not being, I don't want to get into the real details of it, if you will, but you train, and the first 30 seconds of a firefight is the most chaotic time you'll ever experience. I mean, that was my experience, and I've talked to a lot of guys that say the same thing. But once that is over with, then your training, your instincts kick in, and you start doing what you.
Now, is it chaotic even after even in your 7th or 8th or 9th firefight?
Oh yeah.
It doesn't matter how long you get.
Always,
even if you got used, even if you've done this before it didn't matter.
It may become a little easier, but then again, it's chaotic.
Yeah.
It's that initial burst of six, as we say, and it catches your attention. And of course, a lot of times you're kind of prepared for it because you're in contacts imminent and that kind of stuff. But every now and then when it happens, it comes in a hurry. And you just have to kind of, like you say, catch yourself and settle down and try to do the best you do. And there again, you train your units and those guys down under you, the NCOs. And of course, I was never with a quote regular infantry unit. It was either special forces, and the second time around it was with the Ranger Battalion. So we always had a small select group of Americans, and then you were dealing with the little people, as I call it.
Now, getting them sometimes oriented in the right direction, like herding cats. You never knew what they were going to do. But yeah, it was a little chaotic. That was the experience.
Another question, I'm sort of curious, because you did your first tour very early in the war, relative to the American build-up.
Yes.
And you're in this advanced course with fellow officers who'd all been in Vietnam. Looking back now at that time, when you were particularly in classroom, but also when you're sort of at the officers' club or over for each other's houses for dinner, what did you talk about the war? I mean, what was your sense of how the war was going in your experience? I mean, how did your experiences compare with others?
Well, and again, I alluded there a few minutes ago, the fact that I was with, quoting, I hate to use the term elite group, but it was a small select group of 12 guys on a Special Forces A team. A lot of my contemporaries there at Fort Benning in the advanced course had been rifle platoon and company commanders with a regular unit. Their experiences were a heck of a lot different. They had a big support system around them. They had all these troops out there that they could move, and there were usually on our operations there would be 2, at the most 3 Americans, and the rest of them were what we call the little people. And your air support and your artillery support was not quite as responsive or not quite as quick. And one of the things that the regular units, of course, they had overwatch, what we call overwatch. I think that was the term we were using for the Special Forces camp. So what would happen a lot of times, if we made the initial contact and stirred up the hornet's nest, then the regular units would come in and take over the operation, which, that was a good tactic because they could bring a heck of a lot more firepower. And,
so it has a sense from particularly talking to other officers, you got a sense you compared to them, you were really on your own. I mean, you're not aware of this in Vietnam, but
we kind of knew that. I mean, it was not a blinding flash. One of the things, though, we did come out with, or that I came away with, and a lot of my contemporaries who were in Special Forces did, a lot of the mainline units were, I'll not say jealous, but they were a little, they were less than complimentary of the Special Forces guys because they thought we were getting, even though we didn't get that much support, they thought some of the things we got to do that were a little off the chart, so to speak. They were kind of, I don't say jealous or envious, but then also there was, and I say this in all honesty, at the higher levels, I think there were a lot of people, the general officer level, that did not like what Special Forces was about.
Mm-hmm.
They thought we were mavericks. They thought we were a little strange and wild, especially I don't think I'm getting anything classified here that everybody doesn't know about, the SOG, the Special and Observation Group, as they call them. Surveillance and obligation, I guess that's the thing. But anyway, the SOG guys that were actually going across border and doing a lot of operations over there. But there was, I think, this jealousy at the higher levels, and it's taken a long time for them to finally realize. And today, I think more than ever, the special ops guys, Special Forces, the Rangers, the Navy SEALs, all these folks are held in a high regard by the folks up the chain. So that was not quite evident in Vietnam.
Well, it's interesting you say that because historians have written about that there was a lot of resistance to the idea, for example, of the Green Berets.
Oh, yeah.
And I've often wondered, how far did that penetrate? And it sounds like you felt that.
It came down all the way. But a lot of the contemporaries, guys who were company commanders or platoon leaders, we would just discuss that. And they didn't really know what we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
Built a camp because they were back in a kind of an enclave type situation, and then they would go out and do their operation. We were out on the border. I mean, there was 100 Special Forces camp along the Vietnam, Laos, Cambodian border, and my particular camp that I built was, I think, 8 or 9 kilometers off the border of Cambodia, right off what they call the Parrots Peak, right off the end of it, and that was a big infiltration route. Well, we were just like a sieve. You could only catch so much of it. So much of it would get by you. And our support, like you say, was we
we had artillery. We could get the air support, but not near as quick and responsive as the mainline units do.
I'm sort of curious that it sounds like you in back at Benning are sort of telling these other officers essentially what Special Forces does. That they were so ill-informed.
Well, it was not a new concept, but really in '62 is when Kennedy, came to Bragg and says, "Okay, I kind of like what you guys are about," and gave the Green Beret, set us apart a little bit. I think that was a little bit of not the mystique or the feeling is, these guys wearing their berets around and they think they're, God's gift to whatever. And unfortunately, and I will say this also in all honesty, there were some guys who did take that demeanor and then became a little wild and woolly in their relationships with other officers and in the military. And that is where the maverick type thing grew up. I always tried to, initially I'm an Army officer, I'm infantry, and then I do wear the beret, but I was never.
But some Special Forces did lose that. They really did view themselves as a separate.
They went out a little on the fringes, so to speak.
I wanted to ask you, and then I'm gonna turn it back over to Justin. But what is it like to be back with your wife after being away for a year and in combat? So it's
it was. I have to say this again. Just saying like this. As I always said, it was rougher on the wives and the families than it was on me. And that may sound. I kind of knew what was going on. Now, unlike today, and I'm not. This is not a sour grapes, or I think it's great that they've got the communications capabilities. Every night these guys can email their wives or they can call. I got one phone call through my first year in Vietnam on a ham operator type situation where we had to say, over, and then she would come on and say something, and of course it's being listened to by everybody in the world if they had their ham radio on. But in any event, so like I say, I felt like it was tougher on them. And one of the things I said, if you don't hear from me, that's good news. Now, and I'm not trying to be morbid here, but I said, if a green car drives up in front of the house, that's the bad news.
I am strong. I mean, I'm glad you sort of really mentioned that sort of difference, because I think in another generation, students, particularly when they read this transcript, won't have any conception of the that you were still a male-driven. That was still how you communicated.
I tried to write something, when I could nearly every day, but then again, they might not get picked up for a week. So, my wife would get a block. But to get back to your initial question, when we got back home, or I got back home, the kids, I had, one daughter was, 64, so she was about 3. And the other daughter was born in 65, so she was about 1 or a little older. So it was kind of, they knew who I was, but then again, it was kind of, you had to relearn your family, who you are. And I think one of the things, I have a very strong wife, and we've been married almost 50 years now. So, she became more independent. She had to step up and do a lot of things that I had, quote, done. But she had a strong support. She stayed in our little hometown, and my dad and mother were there, and her folks were there, so they supported her real closely. But she became more independent, and that is not a bad thing, really.
But how does it go? Because how does that sort of
Yeah, and that's a good question, because some folks had some problems from that, because why? So I'm do this or I'm be a little more, but we worked it out and didn't really have any major problems from it. And she was very supportive in my career. If that's what you want to do, then it was tough. The second time in was tougher for her than it was. was for me. I mean, she has said in later years, she said, had you had to go back a third time, I don't know if I could have.
So the third point would have been the breaking
Yeah,
point.
she said that would have been tough.
Yeah.
That would have been tough. At that time frame now, as we got older, say if I was a, major lieutenant colonel and something was going on hot, I think she could have had.
But if she had sort of, because your second, we'll get to your second tour, but your second tour was a few years later. But if there had been a tour, say a break and then another tour, that might have. And
that's one of the things I think we're seeing in today's situation, where these back-to-back tours, and some of these guys now have almost been here three times. And that, even though with all the support and being able to maintain contact, that's got to be tough. And it's tough on the families. It's tough on the families. I just say it's a good family that can survive a lot of this stuff, even today.
Is there anything? Well, let me make sure. Turn it over. See if Justin has any questions.
You talked a minute ago about the operational difference between your special operations guys and your conventional forces. Mm-hmm. What was the difference on the personal level with that, as far as the experience of Vietnam goes?
Well, I guess in looking back on it, they got a better grounding, if you will, in conventional units and how to, operate within the operational framework of things had to, go these certain ways. We were basically out there winging it a lot of times, and were able to, if you were the man on the ground, you were going to call on the shots, whereas a lot of times the company commander was told with the battalion commander, this is what I want you to do, or this is where you want to go. And I will remember one day I don't know who this guy was, got above one of my operations, and he got on the air to ground radio and was telling me, oh, you need to do something. And I just went back at him and I said, if you want to run this operation, you land your chopper and get your ass out here. And that's the last I heard of him. I mean, that's, just maybe not the wisest thing to do, but I was out there in the middle of a, firefight. I didn't have time to hear some guy up here telling me, he wants this and that done. Now, the conventional units, like I say, they set up their operations. They knew they had this type of support. They knew the airstrikes were going to go in here and this, that, and that. Now, we tried to, when we were running a major operation, that we would lay on those kinds of things. But a lot of times, our operations, and what's also interesting, like I alluded to a while ago, there was about 100 camps up and down the border. Each camp may run a different type of operations based on the terrain, if nothing else, where they were. We were down in what was known as the northern end of the plain of reeds. So a lot of our operations were in waist deep water. You get up in the central highlands around Pleiku, those guys were beating through the jungles. So you had just from that viewpoint, it was a lot of difference. And then, of course, with the American, the conventional units, they had the helicopter support. They could pick up and move guys in a hurry if they needed to, if you could get an LZ hacked out. And of course, their medevac situation was probably a heck of a lot better than ours. Again, fortunately, we didn't have the large number of American casualties, but when we did have casualties, we had to submit our requests up through two channels, the Vietnamese channel and the U.S. channel to the medevac. Now, earlier on, it became very evident that if we were in a firefight or in a hot situation, the Vietnamese would not honor the request. They would just deny it. Then that released the American medevac situations. They could come in and pick them up. Now, the little people that had been injured or wounded, they liked that option a whole lot better because they knew they would get picked up, taken either back to Cu Chi, which was an American hospital of the 25th Infantry Division, or they would go back to Bien Hoa, where our Special Forces hospital was. If they were picked up by the Vietnamese medevac, they would go into Cho Lan, which is next to Saigon. And if they had, and this is just saying it like, if they had any kind of extremity wound to the arm, wound to the leg, it was almost an immediate amputation.
because they did not try to, take care of the wound. They would just, the easiest thing, and it's easier to take care of an amputation than it is a serious wound to the lower leg or something like that. So that attitude or that atmosphere was there, and we knew it, and our counterparts knew it.
Just so it clarifies, so in other words, if they were evacuated to a Vietnamese hospital, they knew they were going to lose a whole hand.
If they had a very serious
But
extremity,
in an American hospital,
they would try to save it.
they would try to
Best they
save
could,
it.
yeah.
So
And
it sounds like
they
they
knew
knew this very
they
quickly.
knew that very quickly, and our counterparts knew it. I mean, it was, and there again, that was a difference. That was a major difference, because the Americans, they knew they were going to get medevac back to, a good, solid American hospital. And I'll have to say this: we took a lot of our folks into Cu Chi, the 25th Infantry Division, because that was our Overwatch outfit, and they took tremendous care. Again, it was not, hey, these are Vietnamese, Special Forces guys, their troops, we don't give them, but they gave them as good or better. And as soon as they got them stabilized or could get them, under control, then we would transfer them over to our hospital back in Benoit, in Long Binh, up in that area. So, and that happened in all the core areas. That was just down in our 3 core areas. So, I don't know if that answers your question or not. I get rambling and forget the basic question that you asked, I think. The difference between the conventional and the SF was just a matter of degrees, I guess, as far as what support they had and what we had on a real hands-on basis.
What role did the draft play in the difference between conventional? Because I know Special Forces are all volunteer.
Yeah.
As far as, what the average Joe in a conventional unit is going to experience versus what's a guy in a Special Forces unit is going to experience on a personal level, because, the guy in the conventional unit doesn't want to be there.
Yeah. And that was in some cases a problem. And that was one of the things that I guess would be a big difference between what a company commander or a platoon leader in a conventional unit and a Special Forces A-team commander would run into, because you had guys who, number one, volunteered to be there, and they were a little more experienced, at that point. And I guess still today, you had to have been on active duty, I don't know, 2 years, 3 years, be a Spec 4 before you could ever volunteer to go to Special Forces. Whereas in a regular unit, the guys came in, they went to basic AIT, and boom, they were in a regular unit. Not as experienced, and as you indicated, maybe they didn't want to be there. And that would create, I'm sure, some leadership problems that we did not really experience. Now, the second time around, and I'm kind of jumping ahead here a little bit to talk to you about leadership problems that you would experience. This Ranger battalion I had was located next to a 105 or 155 artillery battery. Had a young captain there, and he had this artillery group there. They had a drug problem. And at this point, I was a major, and he would come over and we would discuss, how do you correct, or how do you fight this drug problem? And one of the things we did, and we kind of got our heads together, and like I say, we were not running as many operations then, because the war was starting to draw down, and we didn't have all the assets, and our mission was to kind of hold the line, so to speak. So we devised a plan to start using the 155 battery every night in what we call the Mad Minute. And we would come up with intel, or we would just say, okay, we think we need to shoot at this area. And this gave these kids, really, this artillery battery, something to do, and really something to look forward to, because they said every night, man, we're going to blow up the countryside. And we would try to give them feedback as to what we thought was going on. And one of the programs we had in Vietnam at this time was called Chu Hoi, which basically was a guy would come in and say, I Chu Hoi. In other words, I give up. And this was the VC or the locals that would give up and come in. And the Chu Hoi rate went straight up in our little area, because we, shot at them every night. And they finally said, man, this is crazy. I'm sitting out here and I'm getting shot at nearly every night. And more particularly, if we had good intel, we were hitting their base camps. So we would get that information back to this battery saying, hey, our Chu Hoi rate went up. You guys are doing a good job. And
But it initially started as a way to deal with the drug problem.
One of the ways to deal with the drug problem. And then also, I said, you gotta, and I said, you gotta secure your camp, so to speak, from getting the drugs into the camp. Because the people, the outside, and this was up in the area, was the Montagnards, which was the mountain people up in the Central Highlands. And, they would still get the drugs in there too, and they would get them in there somehow. I don't want to overplay that it was a big problem, but it was a problem that this young captain had. And of course, one of the other ways is the police troop up and send him out of there. If he was a bad actor, so to speak, just wouldn't come around. But that was one of the things we did that kind of helped counteract the drug problem. So there was those kind of differences that you had being in the conventional unit as opposed to special forces and or with the Ranger Battalion. We had 4 Americans out here with the Vietnamese Ranger Battalion. So again, we didn't, and these were, it was a captain and 2 senior NCOs and myself. So it was, at that time, I guess, I was a major by this time. So, again, you're dealing with more experienced guys, and that would be the biggest difference. The draftee, a lot of them became good soldiers, and a lot of them became career soldiers. Once, and as I think I mentioned earlier on, I can't sit here and tell you that, hey, the military is a career for you. But if you get in it and like it, it can be a good career. And that's what happened to a lot of young men that got in there and they said, hey, this is not all bad. One of the things that I still maintain is that every able-bodied young man, 2 years of service to his country, not necessarily military, but if it's in the military, I think he's going to benefit from it. Peace Corps, Habitat for Humanity, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different ways we can cut that down, but I think some kind of service to the country really makes people grow up and appreciate, if you will, what this country's all about. That's just a personal feeling of mine. So doesn't have anything to do with this probably, but anyway.
So were there any real difference in the ways you dealt with the Viet Cong versus the NVA?
Well, for the most part, we ran into Viet Cong. Now, we did not hit any of the mainline units. There were probably some advisors, but basically we ran into the Viet Cong in our situation. Now, the mainline units, the conventional units, now they did hit some of the NVA units that came in. But it seemed like for the most part, we hit the local types or the Viet Cong types. And, the main thing you did, you tried to close with and kill the enemy, I guess is the old infantry byword. But no, we never did hit any mainline NVA units that I was aware of.
Actually, I'm gonna flip this. I want to make sure we sort of say roughly in chronological order. So I want to sort of, after you finished your Benning course, when do you remember roughly what month and year that was?
Oh golly!
I know it's been a while
Yeah.
ago.
It was
you got back from Vietnam in '67. Did you finish it in '68?
Yeah, well, as it ended up, I got to stay at Benning as a kind of a unique, and was the only unit that the Army had at that time was a Scout Dog Detachment. I got assigned there as a Scout Dog commander. Had 450 German Shepherds, and then we trained the Scout Dog handlers for Vietnam. And it ended up I think at one time there were 26
I think this is the correct number, 26 scout dog platoons in Vietnam that supported the mainline units. Now, scout dog, unlike a sentry dog, a scout dog, as the name implies, scouted out in front of the units and did a worthwhile job and did a hell of a job over there and saved a lot of lives. And I was in charge of the unit that trained these scout dogs and also the handlers. And I was there for about not quite a year, I guess. But anyway, it was an interesting tour, and had AWOL dogs and, anything, and, they would break loose every now and then and get, we had the local area around Fort Benning. This was at Fort Benning. The people would say, "Hey, I got one of your dogs down here," because they had a tattoo in their left ear, a number. And the local people knew that, hey, and they were not vicious. I mean, they were German Shepherd, and, they would get after you, but they were not trained to be attack dogs. So consequently, a lot of the locals knew that, and they would call us, and we'd go down and police them up, bring them back. So,
I mean, you have some humorous, stories about that sort of.
Yeah, you say, well, okay, I got an AWOL dog, so let's go see where we could. And we put that word out to the locals in that area around Fort Benning. The dogs wouldn't go that far, but still, that we had to make sure they understood, hey, if a German Shepherd shows up on your doorstep, he's probably one of ours. So, and we had good support from the locals. But anyway, I stayed there at Benning and did that for a while. And then, prior to going to Vietnam the second time, I was sent to the Vietnamese language school at the Defense Language Institute at Monterey. And again, it was 47 weeks, 6 hours a day of learning how to speak Vietnamese. And that became probably one of the best things, when you can speak the language, that just makes it so much easier. Now, I was, of course, not, like a native, but I was pretty fluent. And the counterpart I had with the Ranger battalions, they would speak English. The one in particular had Tuatha Bao, who was a Major Bao from the Vietnamese Army. He wanted to improve his English, so he would speak English and I would speak Vietnamese. And then we would correct each other as we needed to, but we basically could converse without any problem. And that made it a whole lot better when you could walk into a unit and talk to the private out here, if you will, in Vietnamese. Boy, you see their eyes just light up. Oh, this big American, he can speak my language. And that made a very positive influence, a very positive effect.
You mentioned earlier that you had suffered through Czech.
Yeah.
But how was Vietnamese learning Vietnamese? I mean,
Vietnamese is totally different. The Czech language is very structured, very like you had to know English to be able to do Czech because it had the genders and all the parts of speech and everything else. The Vietnamese language, the problem I had with it was the fact that it was tonal and very high pitched. So I had to, kick my voice way up with my voice. It was just, you'll never sound like a Vietnamese. Well, no, unless you throw it up about 4 or 5 octaves, And so I had to do that. And it was not structured. Fortunately, a French Catholic priest, Alexander de Rogues, had Latinized the Vietnamese language. So you didn't have the little curlicues and figures, if you will. You had, regular letters. And so that way it made it a whole lot easier to learn the language. But again, it was very tonal. And a lot of their words, like, a lot of our words, there, they sound the same, but they mean totally different. Well, the Vietnamese had a very difference in a lot of their words. So you had to, listen to that real closely.
I'm curious about the languages to being in Monterey, because now I sometimes think that, given how expensive that area is, why would,
Well,
but I'm curious, what was it like to live in Monterey?
Well,
I get
the first time as a lieutenant, we were out there in the mid 60s there, I guess 64 to 65. I forget exactly. I guess that's when I was there at the language school. We had a little apartment, just had at that time, one daughter, and we lived right next to the Presidio. Mm-hmm. I walked through a gate literally and right there at my class. So that,
yeah.
But it was, the rent district out there was a little bit more than would have.
So you lived off base both times?
Well, the second time then I was able to get on Fort Ord.
Okay.
Lived on 4 doors, and that made it a whole lot less expensive, if you will. Now, looking back on it, and this is one of those things, what if at that point, Carmel Valley, out from Carmel, I don't know if you've been in, the area.
I don't know it that well, but
Yeah.
I just know Monterey is not in
it's a high rent.
Yeah, it's a high rent.
Well, at that point, back in the mid '60s, up Carmel Valley had not started to develop yet. Now, had I had the foresight to go up there and buy 2 or 3 acres of land, that would have been my annuity for retirement, because it just boomed in the later years. But I do remember looking, and we weren't interested in buying it all out there, because, like I say, we were living on post. But we would look at some housing, and it was expensive back then.
Yeah.
And of course, it's just gone.
Yeah. Now I think they still have the language there, and I think could you pick a more expensive piece of real estate?
Well, of course they have and of course now that I don't know what they do. The fact that they don't have Fort Ord anymore.
Yeah.
Fort Ord closed. So I don't know where the folk now. They did have on-post housing for the troops. They could live in barracks, but I'm not sure what they do with the quote officers or folks who have a family and have to rent off boats. I don't know. Probably expensive.
I don't think I've asked this question before, but and if I did, I apologize for asking again. But how did your children and your wife, and then, was there a difference, sort of moving around the country?
I think our kids benefited from it. I mean, they don't meet a stranger, and they say themselves that it was a good experience. A lot of different people. Our oldest daughter, for instance, went to 3 different high schools, and none of them think that was
because some families it's a disaster.
Oh, it is.
But it sounds like I'm sort of curious, because I also think in some ways you don't take any place that seriously, because if there's this one place is cliquish, but
we had good experiences everywhere we went. Tried to see as much as we could in the areas. My wife and I have discussed this on many occasions. We grew up down in Middle Tennessee, a little place called Fayetteville, or if you're from around here, it's called Fayetteville. But in any event, we say, had we stayed there, we're not sure if we'd stayed together. Now, that's being a little facetious there, but it broadened both of our horizons. Mm-hmm. And we've lived in places and saw things that we never would have had we stayed right there in Middle Tennessee. Mm-hmm. So, and for the kids, I think it was a tremendous experience. And most military families, I think, across the board will say the same thing. We got to go to Germany. They got to see a lot over there. They got to ski train and the schools. The Department of Defense school system in Germany was great. Good teachers, and they had good programs for them. So a lot of enrichment type things. Now, we went out to Cheney, Washington, which is about as backwater as you can get, although it's near Spokane, but it was university town. And there again, the kids met a totally different type of kids, if you will. These kids had all gone to school together, all the way from grade school all the way up to high school. So when our daughters moved in here in high school, they ran into a group that had been together for essentially 10 or 12 years, but they meshed right in. Mm-hmm. They were able to just go right in, and plus, and I'll say this, when we were at Fort Bragg and our daughter started high school there, the on-post kids were bused downtown, and to say it like it is, they were used to integrate the high school downtown. It was predominantly black high school. Again, I think this was a tremendous experience for our girls because they got to see a different culture, I guess you would say, than what we had in Europe when they first started high school. So
I'm curious, you mentioned, and this was in your second, when you went back, is this right after Vietnam that you, Fort Bragg?
Yeah, I came back the second time, and actually, after the second tour, I went to Vanderbilt.
Yes, and
got my grad degree, and then went to Command General Staff College, then went to Europe, and then coming back the last tour out of Europe to Fort Bragg.
And that's when they were bused.
Yeah.
So it was in the late 70s.
Late 70s.
They essentially.
Yeah, 79, 78. Well, we came back in 79, so we were there 2 years, and so they were bused off the post into E.E. Smith High School downtown.
What was the reaction of you and your other parents? Essentially being used to integrate.
Well,
Or did-
I use that term, and that that wasn't really said. Oh yeah, we're using these kids, but in actuality, when you looked at it, you said, okay, we got predominantly, and let's say they were predominantly white kids, off post, were going downtown, and of course, they didn't have a high school at Fort Bragg for the military kids. Now, like Fort Campbell up here, I think they had their own high school on post. Didn't have that at Bragg, and a lot of the kids either went to E.E. Smith or there was Sanford, I think, was another high school that some of the kids went to. And I've used that term that, they were used to quote integrate the high school, but it was predominantly white kids. Now there were some black kids on post, but predominantly white kids, and they were put into the predominantly black high school. I think the ratio was about 70-30.
Well, one of the things I'm sort of curious about, is, and you even mentioned your first officer, senior officer was a black officer, that, in the 60s and the 70s, in many ways, the Army is very different from the rest of society.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of race.
Of course, I grew up in the South.
Yeah.
And I went to integrated school. Segregated schools. Never went to integrated school at all until I got to university. And then, of course, there weren't that many here, actually. So going on active duty, and I remember my wife especially, because when we got to Benning and, when you go into the units, well, I didn't really say anything about it. I just said, well, yeah, I've got this fire eater lieutenant that's an exo. He was a little Bandy Rooster about that tall boy. He could bring Pete. Well, his wife called, my wife. And back then, the military was more into afternoon teas, and the ladies got together, and it is more than it is today, for sure. But in any event, his wife called my wife and says, yeah, I'll pick you up. We're going to the officers club. We have the ladies group get together. And my wife had no idea that she was black until she picked her up.
So this black woman showed up.
Yeah.
And at first, it sounds like your wife was at first stunned.
Well, she said, yeah, it was a little different, but hey, we were all in the military.
Yeah.
And it was nothing, it was not a big deal for us. Plus, and I have to say, I guess even though I grew up in a segregated society, I grew up on a farm and we had tenant farmers. I had been around black.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was not a brand new thing to me.
Yeah.
But the hierarchy, it was there. I was called Mr. George by these older guys who were our tenant farmers. But I never, very honestly, I never felt like it. Hey, they're my quote inferiors. I'll put it that way.
So after Monterey, what happened next? Is it back to Vietnam? Was there a?
Yeah, after the Vietnamese class, back to Vietnam with the Ranger Battalion.
Well, let me see what, because I know Justin has a number of questions in this area, so I'm gonna make sure I don't dominate.
About how long before you actually went back to Vietnam did you find out that you were going back?
Well, when I went to the language school, the Vietnamese language school, I knew, hey, the next tour is Vietnam. That was a given. So, I knew the whole year I was there in the language school, as soon as it was over and you took your 30 to 45 day leave and you were on your way back to Vietnam. Now, at that point, I didn't know exactly. I knew the first time I was going to be in Special Forces. That was not unknown. The second time in, I thought I was going to go into a program called the MAT program, Military Assistant Training Teams or something like that, MATT. But when I got on ground, they said, hey, we need some guys in the Ranger Command, and what we're looking for are people, like myself, who've been in Special Forces, who had worked with the Vietnamese before. And they said, we're needing to build up the Vietnamese Ranger program. And what they were doing was they were converting the Special Forces camps into Ranger battalions. So I got pulled off and put into that situation, which, as it ended up, and this is a little digression, when I got off the plane up in Pleiku going to the MR2, which is Military Ranger Command 2, the guy that met me was a UT graduate, Tommy M. Johnson. He was 2 years ahead of me. So I knew him, and he knew me. He knew of me, not as much as I knew him, because he was brigade commander. You look on the wall over there, there's 2 straight Tommy Johnsons. They're brigade commanders. And this was the first one, Tommy M. And so, he met me at the plane, and we
go in. They said, yeah, you're going to go out to one of our camps out here. And so, you know, I got into the Ranger Command at that point. And basically, like I say, we were converting the Special Forces camps into Ranger battalions. Just changed the color of the beret and had fewer people, fewer Americans, had the same soldiers, so to speak. And our support system was a little less at that point, too, because things were kind of drawing down. This was in, 70, 71, I guess, when that came about. So, and I went out into the camps, and then I basically became, for the want of a better term, a troubleshooter. When they had a problem in a camp, they would police me up, send me in. Because I had dealt with a lot of the guys had not really dealt with the Vietnamese like I had. And the fact that I spoke the language, that was the key. Because I could go in, I didn't have to worry, because interpreters, you know, number one, they're not as trained in the English language as you would want them to be. So you didn't know what they were actually saying. You know, it might, as they say, things would get lost in the translation. So being able to go in and just tell the interpreter, hey, I appreciate you being here, but I can talk with my counterpart without your help. And again, you right away had a rapport, whether or not they liked you per se or not. And you could tell immediately if they knew what they were talking about, if they knew what they were doing, and you could get things going.
So it sounds like that language institute was money well spent.
Oh, it was totally, yeah. Totally
yeah, I mean that in many ways that would have been a great advantage itself. The first tour.
Oh, tremendous. Because there were times that I knew that I was not getting straight answers, and not maybe out of being devious, but just out of just not being,
literally the
communications. And one of the things I've always said about a Vietnamese, you will never get a yes or no answer. They will not give you. And sometimes I would say, yes, yes or no, and they no, yes or no. They just would not give you a yes or no, because they always want to kind of put a little, caveat in there somehow. But it was interesting. But being able to speak the language was a big plus that second time around.
Do you have any anxiety about going back?
Oh, the second time?
Yes.
Not really. Here again, you had to look at it, or I did, is that, I'm, quote, a professional. And, I'm not going to say there's, when you say anxiety, I said, yeah, I kind of knew what I was getting into. Now, when I got on the ground, I didn't know what I was, I thought I was going to go into this training teams type of situation, and a little not apprehensive, but a little unknown there. Okay, how's this all going to work? Well, then when they said, no, we're going to slot you over here to the Ranger battalions, and you're going to go in an SF camp and change it over. Well, right away, I had a better feeling and a little more understanding of how these things operate. Plus, again, going back to the fact that I spoke the language, and that made a big difference when I went into my first camp. Plus, I had a tremendous counterpart, this Tilta Bao that I referenced a while ago. He was a professional and was really good. And he ran his camp. All I did was just kind of stand back and give him what advice I could when he needed it, if he needed any, plus try to get support for him. And one of the things that we were able to do is shape the supply chain a little bit and get him, better uniforms and a little more, weapons and things like that, better ammunition for him. And that's where we kind of facilitated, really. As far as running the camp or running the operations, he knew what he was doing. There was not much I could give him now. Conversely, as I indicated earlier, we had some other camps that were having problems, and they would police me up, and I ended up being kind of a troubleshooter. And I went into one or two camps. It was just dismal, unbelievable conditions. And being able to walk in and tell that young Dai Wei or the major who was running that camp, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it, and be able to tell him that in Vietnamese, right away I had his attention and cleaned up a lot of the camps. For instance, in the Claymore mines in one camp I went into, Ducklop, unbelievable. The Claymore mines were set up beautiful. They were oriented toward the enemy. But, I took the clicker. This guy didn't even know how to check, to see if they were under power. And I took the little thing and get no signal. We started chasing the lines down. A lot of them were cut. There was no way this thing was going to go off.
So we had to, replace all the claymores. And then we go into the mortar pit and we find, all the charges were wet. I mean, the things wouldn't have ever fired. And it just had, unfortunately, and I have to say this, the SF, the Special Forces guys, had kind of let this thing, and I wrote a big scathing memo, if you will, about what I found in this particular camp, that somebody for a period of time had really not done their job. And it was the Americans. I just had to say
the Americans had really
not done their job, yeah. And so that was one of the things we ran into there in the Central Highlands. So, and that was not in every camp, but there were a lot of things that they had a supply room full of uniforms, and these guys were walking around out here, barefoot. We had these, what we call bata boots. They were little tennis shoes, rubber soles. I said, why hadn't these been issued to these troops? Well, we want to keep. I said, no. We issue these. Let's, we got it organized and had a big issue of, and of course here again, the troop out here, he thought, Santa Claus had come. And it was just a matter of organizing the supply room and getting the stuff issued out. And for whatever reason, they just hadn't done that. So those are the kind of things that I ran into in the camps that were not really wired together right. And then we started operations. We started sending them on operations because they had kind of backed off, running good operations. And again, we got the mortars set up and got some artillery support and things like that for them. And so, it just became that kind of thing the second time around.
It sounds like the second time when you were with the Rangers that the Vietnamese were running it a little more than the Special Forces.
And that was the overall quote plan, if you will, that eventually we're going to be out of here. And we came out in 73, I guess. I think when we pulled that finally. And this was in 71, I guess, 71. So yeah, we were trying to let them fight their own battle, so to speak.
So you were just there to, if they make a mistake,
correct and facilitate. And that's why I'm saying with my first counterpart I had in the Ranger Command, as far as giving him advice on how to run things or tactical, he was straight. He was good. Some of the other camps were less than that. And that's when you had to kind of say, hey, this is what we're going to do and try to train them a little better. And if nothing else, just get them organized. And that's why I harken back to it. I hate to say this, because it's kind of, these were guys that from my quote background, Special Forces guys had kind of, and that's where I think some of the, as we alluded to earlier on, some of the feelings from higher up that the SF guys had not really done a tremendous job later on in the war. Earlier on, I think they had.
Because this was one of the things that was, particularly the Kennedy brothers. This was the big thing about Special Forces. They were supposed to work with quote unquote native populations. And you felt that part of the mission had really deteriorated.
It deteriorated, yeah. And this was, of course, at this point, there were a lot of things had been pulled back and a lot of support had been pulled back. And so maybe the guys just figured out, hey, we're not going to win this thing, and I basically told my guys, I said, we're on our little part of the pie, we're not going to win this thing by ourselves, but we're going to try to prepare these folks so that eventually they can hold on and win. Well, as we saw in 75, it didn't happen.
I'm curious because in the general sense, going back in the second time, the war has become very controversial. That by 70, 71, and we're also in peace talks.
Oh, yeah.
So, I guess,
well,
I'm sort of curious if you could talk a little bit about going back now on a second tour in a very different war, it sounds like.
Very different situation. And then like I kind of alluded to, I was a professional, so I tried to go do my job as best I could. But I felt, I guess deep down, had I wanted to admit it, that, hey, we're not winning this thing. We're not going to, it's a political war at this point. And you will never win a political war. I don't.
So you really had that sense in 76.
I had that sense. I don't, I'm of the opinion you go balls out, you annihilate. We should have been going north, blowing up everything we could. Well, we weren't going to do that. And not to jump ahead, but I think we should have done more of that over here in our situation we've got right now. The rest of the world, and this may be getting way out and way off from the topic here, but I think the rest of the world in general understands brute force. We've got it, but we're sometimes not of the nature to use it. Now, we did in World War II. I mean, we used our brute force there big time. Since then, I don't think we have. And that's just my view of history, and it may be a very simplistic view of it, but in some cases, I think you have to let the other people know, hey, we're willing to, as Teddy said, walk light and carry a big stick, but be willing to use it. And sometimes we didn't do that. So
You've actually given a lot of specifics, but I mean, this is also, and you've alluded to it without using the term, this is the era of Vietnamization of the war. Did you think it was, I mean, what did you think at the time? Did you think it could work or, I mean, it seemed like it worked in your area, but what was your larger sense?
my larger sense, and I'll say this, and you can say, oh no, this guy blowing smoke at us. When I came back after my second tour, I had an uncle who had really strong Democrat. I mean, he had been a Democrat all his life and died as a Democrat. But he asked me point blank, he said, well, what's your opinion? And this was when I got back. In 73, when we finally pulled the plug and closed the doors, and I had a brother my older brother left. I mean, he was one of the last guys out, as they say. He turned out the lights. And I remember telling my uncle, I said, you know, Charles, I said, in 2 years, I think the North Vietnamese will take over. 1975, that happened. Because I just had a sense that they had a little more drive, if you will, nationalism, whatever you want to call it, than the South Vietnamese had. And, you know, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, well, this guy thinks he's a big prophet. But I do remember point blank telling my uncle that. And I remember 2 years later, him coming to me and says, buddy, you called it right on. And I said, well, there was just that feeling that the North had a more drive about it than the South Vietnamese did. And it's just, you know, it's the way it broke out.
One of the things that I'm sort of struck, and I'm curious in Special Forces, did you get this? Did you ever get rotated back sort of for R&R, even in country, say to Saigon or?
Well, yeah, we had we had R&R. I was able on both tours to get to Hawaii and meet my wife and kids. And one time, my mother came with her. Was that the first or second? I forget which one. But yeah, we were able to. Now, you had other R&R sites. Some people went to Australia. Some went to Bangkok, Thailand. And then, of course, Hawaii was a big one. Then also in the second tour, not only did we get a week of R&R back in Hawaii, I was able to take a 2-week leave and actually come back to the States and got back home for a 2-week leave. Now, that was tough going back. More so on my wife than it was me. I said, well, you know, I said, well, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I just hope it's not a damn train, because I had about, you know, 3 months left at that point. But yeah, that was tough coming back after that 2-week leave. Before you got home, you said, man, this is a whole lot better than where I am right now. But you know, you just had to suck up and go.
But I'm curious, like, for example, how often would you get to a place like Saigon, even as part of your duties, or you were, was it the field or coming on R&R? Was there anything in between?
Literally, when I came to R&R the first time, you know, got on a chopper, flew into Saigon, got on a plane, flew to Hawaii. The second time around, of course, we were near Pleiku with the Ranger, and so I was able to get back to Pleiku every now and then for meetings and stuff like that. But basically, coming to Saigon or you know, places like that, over at there was a place down south called Vung Tau, which was kind of an R&R spot for the in-country R&R. Never got to Vung Tau. Da Nang over on the coast. So literally, you would, like you say, fly in. As a matter of fact, when I came back on that leave, I got on the plane in my uniform, jungles, if you will. I had my Class A with me, so when we landed in L.A., I got off the plane and changed into a Class A uniform to fly the rest of the way home. Because the plane left Saigon and flew, I think we stopped maybe in Guam or somewhere to refuel, but we came straight into L.A.
Well, because one of the things I am struck, I mean, and I think every war is different, so one has to be careful. But one of the things having interviewed some Vietnam veterans is, you know, guys based I remember interviewing this one Air Force officer, and he said, at one point we decided to live off base, and we rented an apartment, and we even hired a cook. That in many ways, special forces, it strikes me, is you're always in the field for the most part.
Yeah, for the most part. Now, I will say this. They did have what they call a safe house in Saigon that some guys got back to if they were going out of country or if they got back into Saigon for whatever reason. And then we had our base up at Nha Trang, the overall headquarters for special forces. And it was pretty, it was secure, and they had a lot of, things there. But for the most part, the guys out in the camps,
that was it.
That was it. Yeah, you were kind of out of camp. Now your B team sometimes might have a nice little place you could get back into, but for the most part, and I tried to send the guys off back to the B team for a day or two, or every now and then we'd send them back. And we did send, here again, you asked the question and I kind of danced around it. We did send our guys back to Saigon. I personally.
Yeah, you did not.
I did not get back there. Now, we did send some guys because it was good and we'd tell them, go, blow it out, because when you come back out here, it's back to business, because we had beer out in the camp, but, I said, we're not going to have a bunch of wild parties out here. Now, some of the camps did. I can't deny that for all, but not with my bunch, not on my watch.
I'm curious about, you mentioned the drug problem in the neighboring unit, the artillery unit. What was your larger sense about the impact of the war on the Army by 70, 71, 72, when, both in Vietnam and when you get back?
Yeah, I think it had a very deleterious effect on it, because we saw this happening, and then when I came back, I indicated, after the advanced course, I stayed there as a scout dog commander. I had some of the NCOs who had been scout dog handlers, if you will, in Vietnam. They made E5, came back. They didn't want to be NCOs because they'd never been in garrison. A lot of them had never been in a garrison situation where they had to make sure their squad took care of this or the troops cleaned up the billets and all that. And we saw that when I finally got into Germany then after the Command General Staff College. We had a good cadre of senior NCOs. We had some young NCOs, but that middle NCO area of E6, E7, there was a real problem in that area of good NCOs. A lot of them had just not developed because they'd been in the Vietnam situation, and they just didn't have for the want of a better term, a garrison mentality of how to run a unit on a regular military post, because they'd been in combat or been out in the woods. So that was a problem. And then you had some of the carryover from some of the drug situations, those that they hadn't meted out yet, or weeded out.
I mean, often the term is attached to the Army in the 70s, particularly by 74, 75, that's a sort of hollow Army. I mean, how accurate is that term? Because at times
Well, that's interesting. But this time I was in grad school and Command General Staff College. Of course, the time I got to Germany in 76, again, we did have some holes in the Army as far as having good NCO leadership. Now, the officer corps was still in pretty good shape, but your middle NCO area, I think, is where we had a real problem. I had good senior NCOs, good company first sergeants. We had a lot of good young E5s who probably didn't have combat experience, but they had good training. And so that middle group, the E6, E7, E8, sometimes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting observation. Because, I mean, this point was made about after World War II, how difficult troops had gone through the war to adjust to garrison.
Oh, yeah, garrison duty is tough for a lot of these folks. And more particularly in the Germany situation, in that, you're in a foreign culture, and a lot of these guys just didn't, I don't know, for want of a better term, they just didn't adjust well into that. And there were some of them who were having their family problems at this point as well. Even though Vietnam had ended a while, they were still having some problems along those lines. So yeah, it was the mid 70s was a tough time in the Army for a lot of units.
I want to go back to the movies about the war. What did you? I know the movie The Green Berets got mentioned, but it never got discussed in the last interview. What did you think about that movie?
Well, it was a John Wayne movie. What can I say? It was the good guys always win. It was a entertaining movie, but it was a little over the top, and I can't say it any other way. To digress a little bit, one of the things they did at Fort Benning, that's where it was filmed. A lot of it was filmed. We could recognize a lot of the scenes. And my wife in particular, she to this day, she will tell this every chance she gets about. She was going into the officers club one day, and John Wayne happened to be going in there to, I guess, for lunch or whatever. And she said, I just volunteered to him and said, my husband is a Green Beret. And said, he very graciously said, I'll open the door for any Green Berets wife, and that's been her big thing with John Wayne ever since. And she said, oh yeah, I got to talk to John Wayne direct. But to get back to your original questioning, it was a little overdone, and it was, I think it was trying to paint a very positive picture.
Counteract all the anti-war stuff.
Thing. Yeah, I think so. But as I started to allude to, one of the things they built there at Benning was the Vietnamese, or the camp. I don't know if you remember the scenes where they were going through and searching the camp and everything. Well, they left all that at Fort Benning. Just left it in place. Well, I then used it during the scout dog training for my scout dog handlers. That's where we learned to search villages, and we would put.
So this movie set.
Movie set became part of our training facility, if you will. And we used it. I mean, because it was good. And they had the holes in the spider hole. So we'd put people there and let the dogs learn how to scent and find this kind of stuff.
So this was actually, the set itself was fairly accurate to.
Yeah.
Hollywood movies are Hollywood movies, but it wasn't completely off.
No, it wasn't.
It was useful enough.
It looked a whole lot like and it was based on if I remember correctly from the movie, it was with the Montagnards, the mountain people. They built the pole houses, built them up off the ground, the thatched roofs and everything. So it was pretty authentic as far as the way it actually looked. And like I say, we were able to use it as part of our training for the scout dog.
Since we're on the subject of movies, is there any movie that comes is there a movie that comes close to your experiences or your war?
The only thing I've ever said that was some of the scenes, Platoon, I think was totally, I think that was just way off base. But some of the scenes in Platoon of the firefights, the initial, I alluded to a while ago, the chaotic situation, that captured about as close as anything. But other than that, all the other movies, they're Hollywood. What can I say? I didn't, what was it? I think was it Full Metal Jacket or whatever. Of course, that was more about the Marines. But I didn't have any. I couldn't allude. I couldn't, comment on that one other than the fact it was a little Hollywoody, I guess. But no, I don't. Any of the movies, I don't remember him. That was the only thing I would say. That Platoon,
some of the firefight scenes,
those were pretty authentic.
I'm curious. Because Special Forces in the 1960s was I think in many ways not well known. Even you mentioned it wasn't well known among much of the military.
Well,
but now it has such a mystique. There is really.
Well, through the years, they have finally organized it. Number one, after the fiasco we had there in the desert with the trying to rescue the hostages, at that point. And General Steiner, who is actually from up here in East Tennessee, and I don't know if you've been able to lasso him to get him to sit down. He's not a Tennessee graduate. He was a Tennessee Tech graduate, I believe, but he's a 4-star general. I'm sure he could really give you some insight into some things. But and he was in part of that operation, and he said at that point, we said, we have got to get a unified command if we're going to run special ops. You can't just let the Navy do theirs and Air Force do theirs. Army do theirs, and
we've got to bring it under one unified command, and they've done that through the years. Of course, now we have SOCOM, which is Special Operations Command, still down at MacDill Air Force Base. I think that's where it's located, part of it over at Bragg. So through the years, it's evolved, and a guy that I worked for, General Joe Lutz, that I worked for in Vietnam, he was a major at that time. He was one of the instrumental driving forces behind getting things organized. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but you'll see his name in some of the movers to get it put together in one little unified command. So, and plus, I think they finally have realized, and they're realizing it more and more in this war on terror, that the special ops, and I'm not just talking about Green Berets, but the special ops in general can do a lot of things and they're doing things today that you and I don't even know about. And, they've got the technique, and they've had the training and the background and the support to get it done.
But in the popular consciousness, I mean, there are now scores of, I mean, not usually based on no sense of reality, but I mean, how have you sort of viewed that?
Yeah, there's a lot of people, and of course the mystique that you talk about let's see, how can I say this? I don't go around saying, oh yeah, I was a Green Beret. That's just not my nature. But if someone asks, well, now what were you doing? I said, well, yeah, I was in Special Forces. And they'll ask the question, well, now was that the Green Berets? And I say, yeah. And they get that kind of wild-eyed look at you like, oh my God. And I tell them, I say, guys, I'm not a wild-eyed killer. I was in there and I did my job, and there is that little mystique out there. But today's special ops guys are so much better trained than we were, I think, and of course better equipped and the whole thing. And they're doing things around the world, all around the world. We've still got we used to call them the mobile training teams, MTTs out there, and I'm sure they're doing it today in places we don't even know about.
Well, I wanted to sort of go back a little into chronological order. After your second tour of Vietnam, what happened next? Where did the Army?
Came back to, and while I was in Vietnam, that second tour, I applied for what they call the ADPRID, Advanced Degree. I forget what the acronym stands for, but basically you applied for an advanced degree, and then you would stay at that school and be an ROTC instructor. Well, in my infinite wisdom, I applied for Tennessee, Georgia, or Alabama, because I wanted to see good Southeastern Conference football. That was the ulterior motive in the back of my head. Of course, I want to come back to UT. Well, there was no slots, as they say, or no room in the inn, and they came back and said, we have a slot in Vanderbilt. And my initial reaction, I'll be very honest here, I said, well, there's no way I can, qualify to get in Vanderbilt. And of course, they said, well, you got to take the graduate exam and all this. So I did, and as it came about, they did, send me to Vanderbilt for a graduate degree. I think that's where I told you I met Dr. Leffler.
Yes, Mel Leffler. Yes.
Yeah, and of course, I went there to study history or get my degree in history. I was a history major here at the university, and then stayed with the ROTC department and taught military history there for 2 years, and then left there and went to Command General Staff College. Got selected to Command General Staff College, so I taught there for 2 years. Very interesting. Of course, I did my graduate degree, and they did require me to take 12 extra hours, I believe, of history to kind of bring me up to snuff, and had some real good instructors over there. Not instructors, professors, military term. Had a Dr. Borman. I don't know if you remember him, the Dr. Grantham. Grantham,
his name is well
known. I enjoyed his classes, and we got along. And of course, Dr. Leffler, I enjoyed his classes. He jerked me pretty hard on a paper I turned into him. I'll never forget. He wrote it in a passive voice, and which that's
sounds very familiar.
Well, you probably know it, so And,
this is a common refrain on my part.
But it was enjoyable. So anyway, stayed there for the 2 years and taught history, military history. Well, we opened it up to the student body in general, not only the ROTC students. And it ended up, I had more non-military students than I had ROTC students in the class. And I did, try to jazz it up and do some wild and woolly things, but I brought in outside guys, a guy who had been a Revolutionary War, and he was a doctor, he was there on the staff, Dr. Leach.
Oh yes, yeah. No, I've heard. Yeah, he's well known. He's passed away, but
oh, is that right?
Yeah.
But he would come in. I mean, he put on some and we had another guy who would, for the Civil War area, he would come in and literally take the students out there. And naturally, there was a lot of battles and stuff fought there, and he knew, the ins and outs. So he tried to, jazz it up a little bit. And then I did some crazy things too in my class. I rang bells and waved. This is one of the things I did. I waved my orange and white shaker, because they all knew that I was a UT graduate. And then, of course, the students, I could go into all kinds of stuff if they did things to me, and it was always in good fun and everything, but we had a lot of fun at it. But one of the things I did do in the class, instead of prior to that, and for the not unfortunately, for the most part, they'd given multiple choice, kind of very blasé exams. Well, no. We're going to write term papers and we're going to have essay exams. And I would give them a situation like, you're a reporter for the Washington Post and you're following Lee into such and so battle. Give me what happened in this battle, lay it out. What were the reasons they lost or won or whatever? That was the kind of types of questions I would give. If it was, for the Civil War, and then the other situations would be the same thing. And it caused them to think a little bit and also to have to write. One of the things I found, and this is kind of interesting, I may have alluded to this before to you, Dr. Taylor, is that, of course, Vanderbilt students, erudite, well-founded, but a lot of them could not write that great. I didn't think. I was not a great writer myself, as Dr. Leffler pointed out to me, but but spelling and just those kinds of things, and I would redline them and say, hey, you're getting docked if you don't check your spelling. There's a dictionary I'm sure that you can lay your hands on. I don't care if you use them in class. At least you'll. So I kind of put a little more Johnson style on them when I was grading the term papers and those kinds of things. And then the essay exams, I'd redline them a little bit for that kind of stuff. So, but I was surprised that you think of the Vanderbilt student has got to be, really top notch.
It seems like this was a bit of a surprise to you at first.
It was. It really was.